for meaning and the world order. Introduction. I suppose that sooner or later the physicists will complete the catalogue they've been compiling of the ultimate and irreducible properties of things. When they do, the likes of spin, charm, and charge will perhaps appear upon their list. But about Miss 1T, intention, simply doesn't go that deep. It is hard to see, in face of this consideration, how one can be a realist about intentionality without also being, to some extent or other, a reductionist. If the semantic and the intentional are real properties of things, it must be in virtue of their identity with, or maybe of their supervenience on, properties that are themselves neither intentional nor semantic. If aboutness is real, it must be really something else. And, indeed, the deepest motivation for intentional irrealism derives not from such relatively technical worries about individualism and holism as we've been considering, but rather from a certain ontological intuition, that there is no place for intentional categories in a physicalistic view of the world, that the intentional can't be naturalized. It is time that we should face this issue. What is it then, for a physical system to have intentional states? Let us, to begin with, try to get clear on just where the naturalization problem arises in the sort of account of propositional attitudes that I've been pushing. I've assumed that what most needs to be explained about the attitudes is that they have conditions of semantic evaluation, such facts as that beliefs have truth conditions, for example. Now, according to my story, you generate conditions for the semantic evaluation of an attitude by fixing a context for the tokenings of certain symbols which jointly constitute a system of mental representations. The reader will recall that RTM is operative, and that RTM identifies token attitudes with relations between organisms and the token mental representations that they entertain. So, then, what is it to fix a context for a system of mental representations? Well, whatever else you have to do, you must at least specify an interpretation for items in the primitive non-logical vocabulary of the language to which the symbols belong. To, for example, you fix a context for tokenings of the mentalese expression "this is water" by specifying, inter alia, that in the context in question the symbol water expresses the property H2O, or the property XYZ, or whatever. Granting an interpretation of the primitive non-logical vocabulary J, the business of generating conditions of evaluation for derived formulas can proceed by means which, though certainly not unproblematic, are at least familiar, viz., by the construction of a truth definition. In short, given RTM, the intentionality of the attitudes reduces to the content of mental representations. Given a truth definition, the content of mental representations is determined by the interpretation of their primitive non-logical vocabulary. So it is the interpretation of the primitive non-logical vocabulary of mentalese that is at the bottom of the pile according to the present view. Correspondingly, we would have largely solved the naturalization problem for a propositional attitude psychology if we were able to say, in non-intentional and non-semantic idiom, what it is for a primitive symbol of mentalese to have a certain interpretation in a certain context. Alas, I don't know how to carry out this program. But I see no principled reason why it can't be carried out. I even imagine that we might make a little progress within the foreseeable future. In particular, I think it is plausible that the interpretation of primitive, non-logical, from now on I'll omit these qualifiers, mentalese symbols is determined by certain of their causal relations. For example, what makes it the case that the mentalese symbol, water, expresses the property H2O is that tokens of that symbol stand in certain causal relations to water samples. Presumably if tokens of water have a different interpretation on twin earth, or, equivalently, if twin earth counts as a different context for tokens of water, or, equivalently, if tokens of water are type distinct from tokens of water 2, or, equivalently, if mentalese 2 counts as a different language from mentalese, that is all because it has XYZ that bears to water 2 tokens the sort of causal relations that H2O bears to tokens of water. So the causal story goes. I think it points a promising route to the naturalization of such semantics as RTM requires. At a minimum, I think that some of the standard objections to that sort of story can be met. That is what I propose to argue in the following. Here, then, are the ground rules. I want a naturalized theory of meaning, a theory that articulates, in non-semantic and non-intentional terms, sufficient conditions for one bit of the world to be about, to express, represent, or be true of, another bit. I don't care, not just now at least, whether this theory holds for all symbols or for all things that represent. Maybe the occurrence of smoke expresses the proximity of fire, maybe the number of tree rings expresses the age of the tree, maybe the English predicate is red expresses the property of being red, maybe the thermostat represents the temperature of the ambient air, see note 1. It is okay with me if any or all of this is so, but I'm not particularly anxious that the theory that naturalizes the semantic properties of mental representations should work for smoke, tree rings, or English words. On the contrary, I'm prepared that it should turn out that smoke and tree rings represent only relative to our interests in predicting fires and ascertaining the ages of trees, that thermostats represent only relative to our interest in keeping the room warm, and that English words represent only relative to our intention to use them to communicate our thoughts. I'm prepared, that is, that only mental states, hence, according to RTM, only mental representations, should turn out to have semantic properties in the first instance, hence, that a naturalized semantics should apply, strictu dictu, to mental representations only. But it had better apply to them. The crude causal theory. Let's start with the most rudimentary sort of example, the case where a predicative expression, horse as it might be, is said of, or thought of, an object of predication, a horse, as it might be. Let the crude causal theory of content be the following. In such cases the symbol tokenings denote their causes I and the symbol types express the property whose instantiations reliably cause their tokenings. So, in the paradigm case, my utterance of horse says of a horse that it is one. Reliable causation requires that the causal dependence of the tokening of the symbol upon the instancing of the corresponding prop, be counterfactual supporting, either instances of the property actually do cause tokenings of the symbol, or instances of the prop, would cause tokenings of the symbol were they to occur, or both. I suppose that it is necessary and sufficient for such reliable causation that there be a nomological, lawful, relation between certain, higher order, properties of events, in the present case, between the property of being an instance of the property horse and the property of being a tokening of the symbol horse. The intuition that underlies the crude causal theory is that the semantic interpretations of mental symbols are determined by, and only by, such nomological relations. You can see straight off why the crude causal theory has a much 100 charter 4 better chance of working for mental representations than it does for example, English words. CCT wants the tokening of a symbol to depend upon the instantiation of the property it expresses. But whether an English word gets tokened, for example, uttered, depends not just on what it means but also upon the motivations, linguistic competences, and communicative intentions of English speakers. Giving voice to an utterance, unlike entertaining a thought, is typically a voluntary act. So, for example, suppose Smith notices that Mary's hair is on fire, and hence, perforce, thinks, Mary's hair is on fire, thereby tokening the mentalese expression whose truth condition is that Mary's hair is on fire. Whether he then chooses to say Mary's hair is on fire thereby tokening the English expression whose truth condition is that Mary's hair is on fire, depends on whether he thinks that Mary, or some other suitably situated auditor, would be interested to know that Mary's hair is on fire. Paul Grice has made us all aware how complex these sorts of pragmatic determinants of speech acts can become. In short, the causal dependence of tokenings of mental representations upon semantically relevant situations in the world is typically more reliable than the causal dependence of tokenings of English expressions upon semantically relevant situations in the world. That's because the chains that connect tokenings of mental representations to their semantically relevant causes are typically shorter than, indeed, are typically links in, the chains that connect tokenings of English sentences to their semantically relevant causes. This is the principal reason why it is mental representations, and not the formulas of any natural language, that are the natural candidates for being the primitive bearers of semantic properties. If, however, mental representations are the bearers of semantic properties in the first instance, then it is the semantic properties of mental representations that are, in the first instance, apt for naturalization. CCT and RTM are made for one another. Which is not, of course, to say that the crude causal theory will work for mental representations, only that it is unlikely to work for anything else. CCT has, I admit it, lots of problems. I want to argue, however, that some of what look to be its worst problems have natural and appealing solutions. This makes me hopeful that maybe, someday, some refinement of the crude causal theory might actually be made to work. Maybe. The crude causal theory says, in effect, that a symbol expresses a property if it is nomologically necessary that all and only instances of the property cause tokenings of the symbol. There are problems with the all part, since not all horses actually do cause horse tokenings, and there are problems with the only part. Cows sometimes cause error in the crude causal theory and embarrassment. It seems that, according to CCT, there can be no such thing as misrepresentation. Suppose, for example, that tokenings of the symbol are nomologically dependent upon instantiations of the property a, viz., upon a's. Then, according to the theory, the tokens of the symbol denote a's, since tokens denote their causes, and they represent them as a's, since symbols express a property whose instantiations cause them to be tokened. But symbol tokenings that represent a's as a's are ipso facto veridical. So it seems that the condition for an IA token meaning a is identical to the condition for such a token being true. How, then, do you get unveridical IA tokens into the causal picture? This may not look awfully worrying so far, since it invites the following obvious reply. Sometimes A tokens are caused by A's, and thus represent their causes as A's, and are thus veridical, but other times A tokens are caused by B's where, as we may suppose, whatever is B is not A. Well, since IA tokens express the property of being A tokens that are caused by Bs represent Bs as A's and are ipso facto not veridical. JA tokens that are caused by Bs are ipso facto misrepresentations of their causes. That's how misrepresentation gets into the causal picture. But though that answer sounds alright, CCT can't make it stick. Since there are B-caused tokenings of IA, it follows that the causal dependence of A's upon A's is imperfect. A's are sufficient for the causation of A's, but so too are Bs. If, however, symbols express the properties whose instantiations reliably cause them, it looks as though what JA must express is not the property of being A, or the property of being B, but rather the disjunctive property of being A v B. Horse tokenings, for example, when they are mistaken for horses. The main business of this chapter will be the consideration of these problems, in reverse order. So here is what I am going to do. I shall start by assuming contrary to fact, of course, that all horses cause horses, and I'll show you why a causal theory doesn't need to require that only horses do consonant with horse meaning horse. Having thus fixed the only clause, I'll then go back and fix the all clause. We will then have a slightly less crude causal theory, one that requires neither that all horses cause horses nor that only horses do, but that nevertheless claims that it is in virtue of the causal connections between horses and horses that horse means what it does. This slightly less crude causal theory I shall then commend to your kind consideration. But if A expresses the property, A v B, then B-caused tokenings are veridical after all. They're not misrepresentations since, of course, Bs are A v B. But if B-caused tokenings are true of their causes, then we don't yet have a theory of misrepresentation. That's what I'll call the disjunction problem. We can put it that a viable causal theory of content has to acknowledge two kinds of cases where there are disjoint causally sufficient conditions for the tokenings of a symbol. The case where the content of the symbol is disjunctive, A expresses the property of being, A v B, and the case where the content of the symbol is not disjunctive and some of the tokenings are false, A expresses the property of being A, and B-caused tokenings misrepresent. The present problem with the crude causal theory is that it is unable to distinguish between these cases. It always assigns disjunctive content to symbols whose causally sufficient conditions are themselves disjoint. The disjunction problem is extremely robust. So far as I know, it arises in one or another guise for every causal theory of content that has thus far been proposed. Accordingly, there are various ideas for circumventing it in the literature in which such theories are espoused. None of these proposals has been very satisfactory, however, and the rumor has gotten around that the problem that causal theories have with misrepresentation is perhaps intrinsic and ineliminable. See, for example, Matthews, TWR. I'm about to try and squash that rumor. First, however, let's look at the remedies currently on offer. Dritsk's solution Fred Oresk's important book Knowledge and the Flow of Information was largely responsible for the present widespread enthusiasm for causal theories of content, so his treatment of misrepresentation bears careful consideration. 3 for Oresk. The cardinal semantic relation is the one that holds between two events when one of them, the tokening of a symbol, as it might be, transmits information about the other. Here is how he proposes to construe misrepresentation in that theoretical context. In the learning situation, special care is taken to see that incoming signals have an intensity, a strength, sufficient unto delivering the required piece of information to the learning subject. Such precautions are taken in the learning situation in order to ensure that an internal structure is developed with the information that S is F. But once we have meaning, once the subject has articulated a structure that is selectively sensitive to information about the F-ness of things, instances of this structure, tokens of this type, can be triggered by signals that lack the appropriate piece of information. We, thus, have a case of misrepresentation, a token of a structure with a false content. We have, in a word, meaning without truth. KFI 194-195, emphasized risks. All you need to know to understand this well enough for present purposes is that Oresk's notion of information is fundamentally that of counterfactual supporting correlation. Events of type carry information about events of type to the extent that the latter sort of events are reliably causally responsible for events of the former sort. There is, in fact, rather more than this to Dritsk's official account of information, but none of the rest is essential to his treatment of the problem of false content. So information reduces to a certain sort of correlation. And the problem is this: correlations can be better or worse, more or less reliable, but there is no sense to the notion of a miscorrelation, so there appears to be nothing for Dritsk to make a theory of misinformation out of. His solution is to enforce a strict distinction between what happens in the learning period and what happens thereafter. The correlation that the learning period establishes determines what events represent, and it is the teacher's function to ensure that this correlation reliably connects the tokens to A's. It may be, however, that after the learning period tokens are brought about by something other than A's, by BS, for example. If so, then these are, as I'll sometimes say, wild tokenings, and their content is false. I think this move is ingenious but hopeless. Just for starters, the distinction between what happens in the learning period and what happens thereafter surely isn't principled. There is no time after which one's use of a symbol stops being really shaped and starts to be, as it were, in earnest. Perhaps idealization will bear some of the burden here, but it is hard to believe that it could yield a notion of learning period sufficiently rigorous to underwrite the distinction between truth and falsity, which is after all, exactly what's at issue. Moreover, if Dritsk insists upon the learning period gambit, he thereby limits the applicability of his notion of misrepresentation to learned symbols. This is bad for me because it leaves no way for innate information to be false, and it is bad for Dritsk because it implies a dichotomy between natural representation, smoke and fire, rings in the tree and the age of the tree, and the intentionality of mental states. Dritsk is explicit that he wants a naturalized semantics to apply in the same way to all such cases. But the real problem about Dritsk's gambit is internal. Consider a trainee who comes to produce JA tokens in a circumstances during the learning period. And suppose that the teacher does his job and ensures that only A's elicit JA tokenings in the course of training. Well, time passes, a whistle blows, or whatever, and the learning period comes to an end. At some time later still, the erstwhile trainee encounters an instance of B and produces an JA in causal consequence thereof. The idea is, of course, that this B elicited tokening of A is ipso facto wild and, since it happened after the training ended, it has the false content that A. But this won't work. It ignores counterfactuals that are clearly relevant to determining which symbol-to-world correlation the training has brought about. Imagine, in particular, what would have happened if an instance of B had occurred during the training period. Presumably what would have happened is this, it would have caused a tokening of IA. After all, BS are supposed to be sufficient to cause IA tokenings after training, that is the very supposition upon which Dritsk's treatment of wild JA tokenings rests. So we can also assume indeed, we can stipulate, that if AB had occurred during training, it too would have brought about an IA. But that means, of course, that if you take account of the relevant counterfactuals, then the correlation that training established is, not between instances of A and tokenings of A but, between instances of AV and tokenings of A. Equivalently, what the training established was, not a nomological dependence of IAS on A's but, a nomological dependence of A's on, AVB, 5. So we have the old problem back again. If A's are correlated with, AVB, then the content of a tokening of A is that AVB. So a B-caused IAF tokening isn't false. So we're still in want of a way out of the disjunction problem. The teleologica solution, a suggestion that crops up in several recent papers about causation and content, see stamp, TCTLR, and also a manuscript of mine, Fodor, P, goes like this. We suppose that there's a causal path from A's to A's and a causal path from B's to IA's, and our problem is to find some difference between B-caused IA's and A-caused IA's in virtue of which the former but not the latter misrepresent. Well, perhaps the two paths differ in their counterfactual properties. In particular, though A's and B's both cause A's as a matter of fact, perhaps we can assume that only A's would cause A's in, as one says, optimal I circumstances. We could then hold that a symbol expresses its optimal property, viz., the property that would causally control its tokening in optimal circumstances. Correspondingly, when the tokening of a symbol is causally controlled by properties other than its optimal property, the tokens that even are ipso facto wild. Now, I'm supposing that this story about optimal circumstances is proposed as part of a naturalized semantics for mental representations. In which case it is, of course, essential that it be possible to say what the optimal circumstances for tokening a mental representation are in terms that are not themselves either semantical or intentional. It wouldn't do, for example, to identify the optimal circumstances for tokening a symbol as those in which the tokens are true. That would be to assume precisely the sort of semantical notions that the theory is supposed to naturalize. Well, the suggestion, to put it in a nutshell, is that appeals to optimality should be buttressed by appeals to teleology. Optimal circumstances are the ones in which the mechanisms that mediate symbol tokenings are functioning as they are supposed to. In the case of mental representations, these would be paradigmatically circumstances where the mechanisms of belief fixation are functioning as they are supposed to. The reference to mechanisms of belief fixation perhaps makes this look circular, but it is not. At least not so far. Remember that we're reassuming a functional theory of believing, though not, of course, a functional theory of believing that P. See Chapter 3. On this assumption, having a belief is just being in a state with a certain causal role, so in principle at least, we can pick out the belief states of an organism without resort to semantical or intentional vocabulary. But then it follows that we can pick out the organism's mechanisms of belief fixation without recourse to semantical or intentional vocabulary. The mechanisms of belief fixation are, of course, the ones whose operations eventuate in the organisms having beliefs. So, then, the teleology of the cognitive mechanisms determines the optimal conditions for belief fixation, and the optimal conditions for belief fixation determine the content of beliefs. So the story goes. I'm not sure that this teleology /optimality account is false, but I do find it thoroughly unsatisfying. The story has it that only A's cause IA's in optimal circumstances, hence, that when the mechanisms of belief fixation are operating properly the beliefs they fix are true. But how do we know, or rather, why should we believe, that the mechanisms of belief fixation are designed always to deliver truths? Suppose some of these mechanisms are designed to repress truths, for example, the acknowledgement of which would be unbearable. For clearly we can't define optimal circumstances in terms of the teleology of those mechanisms, not if we're to define truth conditions as the ones that are satisfied when a symbol is caused in optimal circumstances. But there is no obvious way to weed mechanisms of repress, shorn out of the definition of optimality unless we can independently identify them as mechanisms of repression, viz., as mechanisms tending to the fixation of beliefs that are false. To put this objection in slightly other words, the teleology story perhaps strikes one as plausible in that it understands one normative notion, truth, in terms of another normative notion, optimality. But this appearance of fit is spurious. There is no guarantee that the kind of optimality that teleology reconstructs has much to do with the kind of optimality that the explication of truth requires. When mechanisms of repression are working optimally when they work, as they presupposed to, what they deliver are likely to be falsehoods. Or again, there's no obvious reason why conditions that are optimal for the tokening of one sort of mental symbol need be optimal for the tokening of other sorts. Perhaps the optimal conditions for fixing beliefs about very large objects, you do best from the middle distance, are different from the optimal conditions for fixing beliefs about very small ones, you do best from quite close up. Perhaps the conditions that are optimal for fixing beliefs about sounds, you do best with your eyes closed, are different from the optimal conditions for fixing beliefs about sights, you do best with your eyes open. But this raises the possibility that if we are to say which conditions are optimal for the fixation of a belief, we'll have to know what the content of the belief is, what it is a belief about. Our explication of content would then require a notion of optimality whose explication in turn requires a notion of content, and the resulting pile would clearly be unstable. As I say, I'm uncertain whether these sorts of objections to the optimality/teleology story can be met, but I propose to delay having to meet them as long as I can. In particular, I think maybe we can get a theory of error without relying on notions of optimality or teleology, and if we can, we should. All else being equal, the less pop Darwinism the better surely. How to solve the disjunction problem? We need a way to break the symmetry between A caused La tokenings, which are, by hypothesis, true, and B caused IA tokenings, which are, by hypothesis, false. In particular, we need a difference between A caused IA tokenings and B caused IA tokenings that can be expressed in terms of non-intentional and non-semantic properties of causal relations, for non-intentional and non-semantic properties of causal relations are all that the crude causal theory of content has to play with. My suggestion is that the teleological story was on the horses, equals A, cows, equals B, plus / I horse, equals 1 am, figure 1 right track in appealing to the counterfactual properties of the causal relations between A's and A's, on the one hand, and B's and A's, on the other. Only the teleological story got hold of the wrong counterfactual properties. It is an old observation, as old as Plato, I suppose, that falsehoods are ontologically dependent on truths in a way that truths are not ontologically dependent on falsehoods. The mechanisms that deliver falsehoods are somehow parasitic on the ones that deliver truths. In consequence, you can only have false beliefs about what you can have true beliefs about, whereas you can have true beliefs about anything that you can have beliefs about at all. So the intuition goes, and I think that there is something to it. What's more, I think that it points the way out of the disjunction problem. Consider the following situation: I see a cow which, stupidly, I misidentify. I take it, say, to be a horse. So taking it causes me to affect the tokening of a symbol, viz., I say horse. Here we have all the ingredients of the disjunction problem, set up, as it happens, for a token of English rather than a token of mentalese, but none of the following turns on that. So, on the one hand, we want it to be that my utterance of horse means horse in virtue of the causal relation between some horse tokenings and horses, and, on the other hand, we don't want it to be that my utterance of horse means cow in virtue of the causal relation between some horse tokenings and cows. But if the causal relations are the same, and if causation makes representation, how can the semantic connections not be the same too? What we want is the situation in figure 1, where the dashed line stands for the representation relation and the other lines stand for causal relations, but how are we to get what we want? Answer, as previously remarked, the causal relations aren't identical in their counterfactual properties. In particular, misidentifying a cow as horse wouldn't have led me to say horse except that there was independently a semantic relation between horse tokenings and horses. But for the fact that the word horse expresses the property of being a horse, but for the fact that one calls horses horses, it would not have been that word that taking a cow to be a horse would have caused me to utter. Whereas, by contrast, since horse does mean horse, the fact that horses cause me to say horse does not depend upon there being a semantic or, indeed, any connection between horse tokenings and cows. From a semantic point of view, mistakes have to be accidents. If cows aren't in the extension of horse, then cows being called horses can't be required for horse to mean what it does. By contrast, however, if horse didn't mean what it does, being mistaken for a horse wouldn't ever get a cow called horse. Put the two together and we have it that the possibility of saying that's a horse falsely presupposes the existence of a semantic setup for saying it truly, but not vice versa. 5 Put it in terms of CCT, and we have it that the fact that cows cause one to say horse depends on the fact that horses do, but the fact that horses cause one to say horse does not depend on the fact that cows do. So, the causal connection between cows and horse tokenings is, as I shall say, asymmetrically dependent upon the causal connection between horses and horse tokenings. So now we have a necessary condition for a B caused token to be wild. B caused tokenings are wild only if they are asymmetrically dependent upon non-caused tokenings. 6 What we've got so far is, in effect, a theory that understands wildness in terms of an empirical dependence among causal relations. Since all the notions employed are naturalistic, as per prior specifications, we could stop here. Alternatively, we can press the analysis further by reconstructing the notion of an empirical dependence in the familiar way, viz., by reference to subjunctives. If caused tokenings are wild, if they falsely represent BS as a sum, there would be a causal route from A's to A even if there were no CA usual roll from BS to A's, but there would be no causal route from BS to A's if there were no causal route from a /S to A's. Suppose that a counterfactual is true in a world if its consequent is true in nearby possible worlds in which its antecedent is true. One possible world is near another if, by and large, the laws that hold in the first also hold in the second. C. Lewis, C. So if I were smart I would be rich is true here because I'm rich in the nearby possible worlds in which I'm smart. Then we can spell out the proposed condition on wild tokens as follows. In a world where B caused tokens are wild, and express the property A, the nomic relations among properties have to be such that 1. A's cause FA's. 2 FA tokens are not caused by BS in nearby worlds in which A's don't cause IA's. 3 A's cause IA's in nearby worlds in which BS don't cause IA's. Caveat, these conditions are supposed to apply with, as it were, a synchronic force. For imagine a case where someone learns horse entirely from non-instances. For example, from ostensions of cows, all of which happen to look a lot like horses. No doubt, once horse has been mastered, wild, cow-caused, horse tokens would depend upon tame, horse-caused, horse tokenings, exactly as required. But the dependence isn't, in this case, asymmetric, since the speaker's current disposition to apply horse to horses is a historical consequence of his previous disposition to apply it to cows. Had he not previously applied horse to cows, he would not now apply horse to horses. 750 It looks like we've got error without asymmetric dependence, contrary to the condition previously endorsed. But this is okay, since, as just remarked, the sort of asymmetrical dependence that's necessary for wildness is synchronic, and in the case imagined, my present disposition to apply horse to horses does not depend on any corresponding current disposition to apply it to cows. We get the asymmetric dependence back when we respect the tenses, to put it in a nutshell. As things stand thus far, I'm assuming only that the asymmetric dependence of B caused tokenings on A caused tokenings is necessary for B caused tokens to be wild. I emphasize this point because, on the one hand, it is more obvious that asymmetric dependence is necessary for wildness than that it is sufficient, and, on the other, mere necessity will do for the purpose at hand. 8 The purpose at hand, remember, is solving the disjunction problem, and you don't get the asymmetric dependent of B caused tokenings on A caused tokenings in the case where a means of VB. 5 You pose the form of words blue or green means blue or green, then the fact that you use blue or green, rather than blue, of a blue thing depends on the fact that you use it of green things, and the fact that you use blue or green, rather than green, of a green thing depends on the fact that you use it of blue things. In short, in the case of disjunctive predicates, what you get is symmetrical dependence. Asymmetric dependence thus does what it is supposed to do if it is necessary for wildness, viz., it distinguishes wildness from disjunction. I'm inclined, however, to think that asymmetric dependence is both necessary and sufficient for wildness. I don't think there could be, as it were, adventitious asymmetric dependence, worlds in which IA means BVC, but it just happens that there is a law that CS on T cause IAS unless BS do, and no law that BS on T cause IAS unless CS do. At a minimum, to suppose that there could be adventitious asymmetric dependence begs the question against causal theories of content. A causal theorist has to rule out this possibility whatever he says about error. For consider, according to the causal theory, a symbol expresses a property only if the instantiation of the property is nomologically sufficient for the tokening of the symbol. In particular, if O expresses the property BVC, then the instantiation of BVC has to be nomologically sufficient for the tokening of O. But CS do instantiate the property BVC. So it can T be that A means BVC in a world where CS don T cause S. A causal theorist can acknowledge only one kind of world in which X S don T cause 9S, viz. The kind of world in which X doesn't T mean X dot 9 time. To sum up, we began with the very crude idea that JA means A if all and only A S cause JAS. Neither the all part nor the only part being defensible as stated, we decided to start by whittling away at the latter. This clause can now be replaced as follows: JA means A if all A S cause tilde S and tilde are tokenings that are caused by non-A S are wild. Wildness then gets defined by reference to asymmetric dependence. B. Caused IA tokenings are wild only if B. Caused IA tokenings are asymmetrically dependent on the causation of JA tokenings by non-BS. Correspondingly, B. Caused IA tokenings express the disjunctive property AVB only if B. Caused JA tokenings are symmetrically dependent on A. Caused IA tokenings. And just to round things off, ambiguity, viz. The case where JA means A and JA means B requires symmetrical independence. AS cause JAS in nearby worlds where BS don T, and BS cause AS in nearby worlds where JAS don T. A brief aside before we turn to other business. The treatment of error IVE proposed is, in a certain sense, purely formal. It invokes a dependence among relations, and it is compatible with assuming that the relations among which this dependence holds are causal, that SY SA help to CCT. But strictly speaking, it doesn't require that assumption. On the contrary, it looks like any theory of error will have to provide for the asymmetric dependence of false tokenings upon true ones. To that extent, the story I've been telling may be of use to you even if you don't care for causal theories of content and even if you're out of sympathy with the naturalization program. I'm indebted for this point to Peter Slizak. So far, so good, but at best this far is only part way. The crude causal theory, pocket version, says that A's express the property if all A's and only A's reliably cause A's. And, as I remarked earlier on, there are troubles with both clauses. It is not true that only horses cause horse tokenings, sometimes cows do, and it is not true that all horses cause horse tokenings. Many horses live and die quite underknotted. Well, it may be that the problems about the only clause are merely technical and that fancy footwork along the lines just reviewed will save it. Instead of saying only A's cause S, we can say only A's are such that A's depend upon them asymmetrically. But the problems about the all clause are, in my view, very deep. It is here that the plausibility of a serious causal theory of content will be tested. And here I can offer no more than a sketch. Toward a slightly less crude causal theory of content, the idea was that my mentally symbol /horse expresses the property of being a horse only if all instantiations of the property cause the symbol to be tokened in my belief box. But that's preposterous on the face of it. What about ancient Athenian horses? What about horses on Alpha Centauri? What about 14th century horses? What about horses in Peking, where, unlike many horses, I have never been? I am prepared to assume that A's do express A if all A's cause A's, for if that's not true, then the causal covariance approach to content is playing in entirely the wrong ballpark. But even if it is true, it has not much comfort, since not all A's do cause /A's, as previously noted. What we need is a plausible sufficient condition for /A expressing a condition such that it is plausible that, in at least some cases, if A's express A because if that condition is satisfied. One is, perhaps, inclined to put one's faith in counterfactuals, Pekinges, Antique Greek, Alpha Centaurian, Postmodern etc. Horses would cause, /would have caused, corresponding horse tokenings if. And here's the rub, because we don't know which counterfactuals to appeal to. The viability of the causal theory depends on its being able to specify, in naturalistic vocabulary, hence in non-semantic and non-intentional vocabulary, circumstances such that, A, in those circumstances, horses covery with horses, I.E., instantiations of horse would cause horse to be tokened in my belief box, I.E., would cause me to believe here's a horse, were the circumstances to obtain, and, B, horse expresses the property horse, in my idiolect of mentalis, in virtue of. The truth of, A. Just which circumstances are those, pray? This is, as I say, a very hard problem. And there is worse, horses aren't the half of it. Suppose that there are circumstances under which horse instantiations are, as it were, guaranteed to stuff tokens of the mentalis expression horse down one's throat, more precisely, to stuff them into one's belief box. What about expressions like proton or is a segment of curved space, time? If the causal theory is going to work at all, it has got to work for the so-called theoretical vocabulary too. But if protons qua protons affect the content of one's belief box, they must do so via a complicated chain of intermediate causes, and some of the links of this chain must be inferences that one draws from the physical theories that one believes. And of course, neither inference and I believe, which are intentional notions, nor theory, which is a semantical notion, are at the disposal of a naturalistic treatment of meaning. Still, it has an ill wind and all that. If reflection on the semantics of distant theoretical terms makes the prospects for a causal theory of content look glum, reflection on the semantics of distant observation terms makes them look appreciably better. L0 to wit, the psychophysical basis. There are circumstances in which beliefs about observables do seem to force themselves upon one in something like the way that the crude causal theory requires. For example, paint the wall red, turn the lights up, point your face toward the wall, and open your eyes. The thought red there will occur to you, just try it and see if it doesn't. To put it another way, to put it in a way that assumes RTM, if enough of the wall is bright enough, red, and if you read close enough to the wall, and if your eyes are pointed toward the wall and your visual system is functioning, then the mentalis equivalent of red there will get stuffed into your belief box willy-nilly. It goes without saying that not every instantiation of red affects the contents of your belief box. Think of all the reds in China. But what we've got is just as good for the purposes at hand. There are circumstances such that red instantiations control red tokenings whenever those circumstances obtain, and it is plausible that red expresses the property red in virtue of the fact that red instantiations cause red tokenings in those circumstances, and the circumstances are non-semantically, non-teleologically, and non-intentionally specifiable. In fact, they re-psychophysically specifiable. Psychophysics is precisely in the business of telling us how much of the wall has to be painted red, more strictly speaking, what angle the retinal image of the red part of the wall has to subtend, and how red it has to be painted, and how close to the wall one has to be, and how bright the lights have to be, and so forth, such that if it is that much red, and that bright, and you're that close, then you'll think red if your eyes are pointed toward the wall and your visual system is intact. To a close first approximation, caveats to follow. Psychophysics is the science that tells us how the content of an organism's belief box varies with the values of certain physical parameters in its local environment. And it does so in non-intentional, non-semantical vocabulary, in the vocabulary of wavelengths, candle powers, retinal irradiations, and the like. Of course, not all the organism's concepts are under the sort of local causal control that psychophysics talks about. For example, the theoretical concept proton patently isn't, and we'll see later why middle-sized object concepts like horse aren't either. Equivalently, not all properties are such that their instances exert the relevant sort of local control on the contents of the belief box. For example, the property of being a proton doesn't, and neither does the property of being a horse. Still, psychophysics does what it does, and ingratitude is a vice. For the concepts and properties that it applies to, psychophysics is just what the causal theory ordered. The crude causal theory, together with psychophysics, provides a plausible sufficient condition for certain symbols to express certain properties, viz., that tokenings of those symbols are connected to instantiations of the properties they express by psychophysical W. This isn't everything, but it isn't nothing either. You can imagine a whole mental life constituted by beliefs about observables equivalently, given RTM, a system of mental representations whose non-logical vocabulary consists exhaustively of observation terms. Perhaps, indeed, the mental life of some animals is rather like this. For such a mind, the crude causal theory, as psychophysically amended, would approximate a complete solution to the naturalization problem. This ought to bother you if your view is that there are principled, metaphysical, reasons why there can't be plausible, naturalistic, sufficient conditions for intentionality. A couple of caveats. It doesn't, to begin with, matter to this line of thought that the observation /theory distinction isn't epistemologically or ontologically principled, for, in fact, I'm not wanting to do any epistemological or ontological work with it. All that matters is that there are concepts, mentalese terms, whose tokenings are determined by psychophysical law, and that these concepts are plausibly viewed as expressing the properties upon which their tokening is meaning and the Wald Order 113 thus lawfully contingent, and that the psychophysical conditions for the tokenings of these concepts can be expressed in non-intentional and non-semantical vocabulary. It also doesn't matter that the tokenings in question be, strictly speaking, in the belief box. It is not required that we view psychophysics as enunciating sufficient conditions for the fixation of belief. It will do, for our purposes, if psychophysics enunciates sufficient conditions for the fixation of appearance. S. The point is that belief fixation is a conservative process. You may stare at what looks to be a paradigm case of red wall, and something you know, some part of the cognitive background, may nevertheless convince you that the wall isn't red after all, where after all means quite literally appearances to the contrary notwithstanding. Belief fixation is about what happens on balance. Psychophysics can't do anything about this. It can't guarantee that you'll believe red there, only that red there will occur to you. 11 But a guaranteed correlation between instances of red and tokenings of red there in the accursed home box will do perfectly nicely for the purposes of semantic naturalization. All semantics wants is some sort of nomologically sufficient conditions for instances of red to cause psychologically active tokenings of red. On this view, the theory of belief fixation strictly so-called belongs not to semanticists but to cognitive psychologists, among whose goals it is to say what determines which of the things that occur to you actually come to believe, how information flows from the occurs to me box to the belief box, if you like that way of putting it. Well, where do you go from here? The psychophysical cases are close to ideal from the point of view of a causal theory. They're the ones for which it appears most clearly possible to enumerate the conditions in which reliable, causal correlation makes content. So a rational research strategy would be to try to work outward from these cases somehow to extend an analogous treatment to apparently less tractable examples such as horse or proton. There's a variety of proposals around that are plausibly viewed as variants of this strategy. The idea that the semantics of observation terms is somehow at the core of the theory of meaning is, after all, pretty traditional among philosophers. Reduction, for example. It would be extremely convenient if one could talk oneself into a reductionist account of the relation between observation terms and the rest of the non-logical vocabulary of mentalese, perhaps something to the effect that any mentalese formula that can express an intentional content at all is equivalent to some mentalese formula all of whose non-logical vocabulary is observational. It would be convenient to believe this because if it were true, the naturalization problem would be largely solved. Psychophysics would be all the theory of mind/world interaction that the semantics of mentalese requires. This sort of solution has, of course, a long and respectable history in the tradition of classical empiricism. In effect, you reduce all concepts to sensory concepts, which are in turn assumed to be connected to their instances by some such natural, viz., putatively non-intentional and non-semantic, relation as resemblance or causation. This is an appealing idea, one which effectively expresses the intuition that the semantics of observation terms is unproblematic in ways that the semantics of the theoretical vocabulary is not. But of course it won't do. Proton and horse aren't the concepts of a set of actual or possible experiences. Nor, mutatis mutandis, are the concepts water and water too. If they were, they'd be the same concept. 12 Or, to put the same point in terms that are congenial to the causal theory, we need a story about how proton connects causally with instantiations of the property of being a proton. And our trouble is that being a proton is not a property in the domain of psychophysical law. Psychophysics gives us a naturalization of a certain set of concepts. The reductionist strategy was to show that all other concepts are logical constructions out of these. But there's another alternative to consider. Perhaps we've underestimated the number of concepts that can be treated as psychophysical. Perhaps that treatment can be extended, if not to proton, then at least to an indefinite variety of concepts that subtend middle-sized objects. Here is how it might go. Psychophysical imperialism. Psychophysics purports to specify what one might call an optimal point of view with respect to red things. 6 Steady, a viewpoint with the peculiar property that any intact observer who occupies it must nomologically must in point of psychophysical law have red there occur to him. Well then, why can't a suitably extended psychophysics do as much for horse? Of course there are instantiations of horses in peaking and so forth, that don't affect the contents of one's belief box. Arguably, however, that's only because one doesn't occupy a psychophysically optimal viewpoint with respect to those instantiations. 4. Plant a horse right there in the foreground, turn the lights up, point the observer horsewards, rub his nose in horse, to put the proposal as crudely as possible, and surely the thought horse there will indeed occur to him. The suggestion is that horses must cause horse tokenings whenever there is an observer on the spot, and that we can rely on psychophysics to tell us exactly what being on the spot consists in. So, all that's required for a guaranteed correlation between horses and horses is what they call in Europe being there. God's omniscience, according to this view, is largely implicit in his omnipresence. Notes toward a truly naturalized theology. It has not, then, lust for red, but also for horse and clock, tower and many, many other such concepts, that psychophysics provides just what a naturalized semantics needs, circumstances in which instances of a property are guaranteed to cause tokens of the symbol that expresses it. This is a proposal rather in the spirit of an 18th century commonplace about how to draw the distinction between perception and thought, whereas thought is somehow voluntary, so that one can, in reflection, conjure up the idea of a horse at will, percepts simply intrude themselves. You can't but entertain the idea horse when you represent it with a horse close up. But then, perhaps the fact that horses force horses upon one in psychophysically optimal circumstances is all there is to horse expressing horse. Just as the fact that red things force red upon one in psychophysical optimal circumstances is arguably all there is to red expressing red. I think that this is all rather pleasing. It is, for example, the grain of sense in the Gibsonian idea that there are ecologically sufficient conditions for perceptual achievements. See also Fodor, p. where something of this sort is argued for, though not in quite the present terms. But it doesn't work. Horse won't do as a psychophysical concept. Here's why. Psychophysics can guarantee circumstances in which you'll see a horse and, presumably, have the appropriate horsey experiences. It can't, however, guarantee the intentional content of the mental state that you in those circumstances. That is because it can guarantee that when you see the horse you'll see it as a horse. Roughly, seeing a horse as a horse requires applying the concept horse to what you see. And of course, intact observers don't have to have the concept horse. So then, it is perfectly nomoologically possible to be in a psychophysically optimal relation to a horse and yet not have the thought here's a horse occur to one. You can now see why Dominion/teleological apparatus does no good for the purposes at hand. Suppose you could get a teleological notion of optimal conditions as e.g. got the ones that obtain when the cognitive mechanisms are behaving as the forces of selection intended them to. Even so, you still couldn't infer from a. the presence of a horse and b. the optimality of the conditions that c. horse will get tokened. 4. There is no Dominion guarantee that a properly functioning intentional system ipso facto has the concept horse, to say nothing of the concept proton. And what you don't have, you can't token. It is, by the way, easy to miss all this if you think of perceiving as just the entertaining of a mental image, that is, as imaging rather than judging. For that sort of treatment leaves the question of the intentional content of the percept wide open. The present point, put in those terms, is that psychophysics can guarantee circumstances in which you'll have a horse image, but not circumstances in which you'll take what you're having to be an image of a horse. Compare Hume, who I'm inclined to think got this wrong for once. Let's go back to red. There are, of course, cases where one sees red things but fails to see them as red, you're too far away to make out colors, the illumination is bad and so forth. But what makes red special, what makes it a psychophysical concept within the meaning of the act is that the difference between merely seeing something red and succeeding in seeing it as red vanishes when the observer's point of view is psychophysically optimal. You can or so I claim see something red under psychophysically optimal view, in conditions and not see it as red. That is, perhaps, the hardcore of truth that underlies the traditional doctrine of the theory neutrality of observation, qua intact observers. We do have some concepts that we token willy-nilly under circumstances about which psychophysicists can tell us the whole story. Perceptual applications of such concepts are, in that sense, independent of not mediated by the perceiver's background of cognitive commitments. But most of our concepts, even ones like horse, certainly ones like proton, just aren't like that. There are no psychophysically specifiable circumstances in which it is nomoologically necessary that one sees horses as such. The box score seems to be as follows. Psychophysics naturalizes the semantics of a certain relatively quite small set of mental representations, viz., those for which the distinction between seeing and seeing as vanishes in psychophysically optimal circumstances. These representations have the peculiarity that sufficient conditions for their tokenings can be specified in entirely external terms. When one's psychophysical situation is optimal, the world, as it were, reaches in and stuffs them into one's belief box. But it isn't true that these concepts provide a reduction base for the rest of mentales, and it isn't true that this psychophysical model can be extended, in any obvious way, to concepts like horse whose tokenings, even in psychophysically optimal circumstances, are characteristically inferentially mediated. To say nothing of proton, for whose tokenings the notion of psychophysically optimal circumstances is thus far undefined, since, of course, protons are very small and you can't see them even with the lights turned up. So what now? At your foundationalism, here's what we want. We want circumstances such that 1. They are naturalistically specifiable. 2. Horses, /protons, reliably cause horses, /j protons. In those circumstances. 3. It is plausible that horse, /proton, expresses horse, /proton, because it is the case that 2. We really do need to know at least roughly what such circumstances might be like, on pain of having the metaphysical worry that, accepting psychophysical concepts, we have no idea at all what a naturalized semantics would be like for the non-logical vocabulary of mentales. Here is how I propose to proceed. First I'll tell you a sketch of a story about 2 and 3, but I'll tell the story in a question-begging vocabulary, viz., in a vocabulary that flouts 1. Then I'll say a little about how it might be possible to tell the same story sketch, only naturalistically. Then I'll ask you to try very, very hard to believe that someday the naturalistic version of this story sketch might actually be filled in, thereby solving the naturalization problem. The story is, I admit, sort of old-fashioned, since, roughly, it connects having concepts with having experiences and knowing meanings with knowing what would count as evidence. Whenever I tell this story to Granny, she grins and rocks and says, Jay, I told you so. The question-begging version horse isn't a psychophysical property, see above, but instantiations of horse are, very often, causally responsible for instantiations of what are psychophysical properties. It is, for example, because Dobbin is a horse that Dobbin has that horsey look. 13 and it is entirely plausible that having that horsey look reduces to having some or other, maybe quite disjunctive, bundle of psychophysical properties, though, of course, being a horse doesn't. Proton is a little different, because there isn't a look, taste, smell, etc., that being a proton is typically causally responsible for a thing as having. Protons are, as previously remarked, too small to see. But I think the principle is very much the same. It turns out that it is possible to construct environments in which instantiations of proton do have characteristic psychophysical consequences. These are called experimental environments. They involve the deployment of instruments of observation, and they are, more often than not, very expensive to build. The reason they are so expensive is that because protons are very small, the observable effects of instantiating proton at a particular position in space-time tend to be fairly negligible compared to the causal contributions of other sources of variance. It therefore requires great delicacy to ensure that a given psychophysical effect really is specific to the instantiation of proton. But, as I say, it turns out to be possible to do so to an acceptable level of reliability, assuming you're prepared to pay for it. We are trying to imagine a kind of connection between horses, or protons, in the world and horses, or proton-s, in the belief box such that it s plausibly because that connection obtains that horse means horse, and proton means proton. The crude causal theory says that this connection ought to be a species of causally reliable covariation. Aside from that, all we know so far is that the covariation can't be mediated by brute psychophysical law because neither horse nor proton is a psychophysical concept. On the other hand, there's no reason why instantiations of psychophysical properties shouldn't be links in a causal chain that reliably connects horses and protons with horses and proton-s respectively. This is a hopeful suggestion, because, as we've seen, there are, presumably naturalistically specifiable, circumstances in which instantiations of psychophysical properties are reliably caused by indeed, are specific to instantiations of non-psychophysical properties such as horse and proton, and, as we've also seen, there are, naturalistically specifiable, circumstances in which instantiations of psychophysical properties reliably causally control what's in the belief box. So far, everything is okay. Physics, including the physics of the experimental environment, guarantees a reliable causal covariation between instantiations of proton and the psychophysical properties of the photographic plate, or the cloud chamber, or the voltmeter, or whatever apparatus you're using to detect protons. If physics didn't guarantee this correlation, what you're using wouldn't count as a proton detector. And psychophysics guarantees a reliable causal covariation between the observable properties of the apparatus and the tokening of concepts in the belief box. If psychophysics didn't guarantee this correlation, these properties of the apparatus wouldn't count as observable. And reliably causally covaries with is, I suppose, fairly transitive enough for the purposes at hand. Remember that what we wanted for semantics was naturalistically specifiable conditions under which instantiations of proton are guaranteed to affect what's in the belief box, our problem being that, patently, not all instances of proton succeed in doing so. Well, we can now have what we wanted. For semantical purposes, we require only that instances of proton affect the belief box if, for a, they take place in an experimental environment i.e., they are causally responsible for the instantiation of psychophysical properties, and b, the experimental environment is viewed by an observer who is in an optimal psychophysical position with respect to that environment. So instances of proton that leave traces on photographic plates that are never examined are ipso facto not required to affect the contents of any belief boxes. Notice that so far we haven't even cheated. Because physics connects protons with the look of the photographic plate and psychophysics connects the look of the photographic plate with what's in the belief box, we can specify the conditions under which instances of proton are required to affect tokens in the belief box non-semantically and non-intentionally. This is much better than the crude causal theory, since we no longer require that all instantiations of proton, mutatis mutandis, horse, need to affect the belief box in order that proton should express proton, mutatis mutandis, in order that horse should express horse. In fact, in the case of proton, though not, perhaps, in the case of horse, the number of instances that have been causally responsible for semantically relevant tokenings of representations in belief boxes is infinitesimally small, vastly, astronomically, unimaginably more protons go undetected than not. On the present view, this is quite compatible with there being mental representations that mean proton. Fine so far. But still no good overall. We've got something into the belief box for which instantiations of proton are causally responsible, but it has the wrong thing. It has not a token of the concept proton, rather, it has a token of some, probably complex, psychophysical concept, some concept whose tokening is lawfully connected with the look of the photographic plate. This is clear from the way that the counterfactuals go. Suppose what happens in the experimental environment is that instances of proton turn photographic plates red. Then what we're guaranteed gets into the belief box of an observer whose situation with respect to the plate is psychophysically optimal is a symbol whose tokens are reliably correlated with instantiations of red whether or not the instantiations of red are causally dependent on instances of proton. It has the same symbol that gets tokened in the belief boxes of observers whose situations are psychophysically optimal with respect to ripe tomatoes. Something needs to be done about this. Here is where the cheating starts. It has clear enough what story one wants to tell. Some people physicists, for example, know about the causal relation between, on the one hand, instantiations of proton and, on the other, the redness of photographic plates that are exposed in appropriate experimental environments. Such people are thus in a position to draw the relevant inferences from the look of the plate to the presence of the particle. So, for these people, there is the required correlation between proton in THLE belief box and protons in the world, mediated as we've seen by automatic tokenings of psychophysical concepts, but also by theoretical inferences that draw upon the cognitive background for their premises. Alas, this sort of correlation does in naturalized semantics no good at all, because to specify the conditions in which the required connections between protons and protons will obtain you have to talk about states like knowing physical theories and processes like drawing inference from what one knows. Utterly anathema, it goes without saying. Well, but perhaps not utterly anathema, on second thought. What we need is some process that will put a token of proton into the belief box whenever a proton in the world is causally responsible, via physical and psychophysical law, for a token of red being in the belief box. Now, what in fact normally performs this function is a theoretically based inference. The observer holds a theory that implies that red plates signal protons, and he applies what he knows to infer the presence of the proton from the color of the plate. When the theory is true, the inferences it mediates will indeed succeed in correlating instantiations of proton in the experimental environment with tokenings of proton in the belief box. True theories when internalized correlate the state of the head with the state of the world. That's exactly what's so nice about them. But though protons typically exert causal control over protons via the activation of intentional mechanisms, a naturalistic semantics doesn't need to specify all that. All it needs is that the causal control should actually obtain, however it is mediated. The claim, to put it roughly but relatively intuitively, is that it is sufficient for proton to express proton if there's a reliable correlation between protons and protons affected by a mechanism whose response is specific to psychophysical traces for which protons are in fact causally responsible. And that claim can be made in non-intentional, non-semantic vocabulary. It just was. No doubt mechanisms that track non-observables in the required way typically satisfy intentional characterizations. They are typically inferential and semantic characterizations. They work because the inferences that they draw are sound. But that is okay because on the one hand, the semantic /intentional properties of such mechanisms are, as it were, only contingently conditions for their success in tracking protons, and, on the other, what's required for proton to express proton is only that the tracking actually be successful. For purposes of semantic naturalization, it has the existence of a reliable mean/world correlation that counts, not the mechanisms by which that correlation is affected. So WHTS proposed is a sort of foundationalism. The semantics of observation concepts is indeed special, first, in that, given an intact observer the nomologically sufficient and semantically relevant conditions for their tokenings are specifiable purely externally, viz., purely psychophysically. And second, in that all the other semantically relevant symbol/world linkages run via the tokening of observation concepts. Horse means horse if horse tokenings are reliably caused by tokenings of psychophysical concepts that are in turn caused by instantiations of psychophysical properties for which instantiations of horse are in fact causally responsible. Is the causal chain runs from horses in the world to horsey looks in the world to psychophysical concepts in the belief box to horse in the belief box. Horse means horse because that chain is reliable. All right, Granny, have it your way. In effect, the satisfaction of this condition for having a horse concept requires that you be able to have certain experiences, and that you be prepared to take your having of those experiences to be evidence for the presence of horses, and, indeed, that you can sometimes be right in taking your having of those experiences to be evidence of horses. Only do stop rocking, you make me nervous. A number of points, all in a jumble and mostly in a concessive and ecumenical tone of voice. First, there's a detectable family resemblance between the present doctrine and Quinn's analysis in word and object of what it is to know a scientific theory like, for example, chemistry. Knowing chemistry, Quinn says, is a matter of the associative if interanimation of sentences. It is a matter of having the right psychological connections between, on the one hand, sentences like this is wet / tasteless / colorless and sentences like if this is water, and, on the other hand, between sentences like FL this is water and sentences like F this is H2O. Thus someone mixes the contents of 2 test tubes, observes a green tint, and says there was copper in it. Here the sentence is elicited by an verbal stimulus, but the stimulus depends for its efficacy upon an earlier network of associations of words with words, viz., one's learning of chemical theory. The intervening theory is composed of sentences associated with one another in multifarious ways not easily reconstructed even in conjecture. 11. Now that is, of course, not what it is to know chemistry. At a minimum, knowing chemistry is a matter of judging that certain propositions are true, and there is, as Kant decisively remarked, no way of reducing judging, as it might be, judging that if P then Q, to associating, as it might be, associating Q with P. Nevertheless, there may be a use for Quinn's picture. It may be that Quinn gives you everything you need to characterize the role of internalized theories in fixing the content of mental representations. Viz., all the internalized theory need do is transfer activation from observation sentences to theoretical sentences on the appropriate occasions, and all that requires is that the sentences involved form the right sort of associative network. So, to that extent, Quinn's right. The part of the story about how internalized theories operate that's essential to their functioning in supporting semantically relevant concepty world correlations can be told in the non-intentional, non-semantic vocabulary of associationism. 16 In similar spirit, there is, in my view, almost nothing to be said for the idea that theories are mere calculating devices when it is proposed as a piece of philosophy of science. But it may be that that's precisely the story that you want to tell about how theories, more generally, bits of the cognitive background, function in fixing the semantics of mental representations. The picture is that there's, as it were, a computer between the sensor and the belief box, and that the tokening of certain psychophysical concepts eventuates in the computers running through certain calculations that in turn lead to tokenings of proton, or of horse or whatever, on the appropriate occasions. De facto, these would normally be calculations that appeal, for premises, to internalized beliefs, and they would actually succeed in correlating protons with protons only when these beliefs are true. But you don't need to mention any of that to say what it is about the computer's calculations that is relevant to fixing the semantics of proton. All that requires is that the computer output proton when its inputs are tokenings of psychophysical concepts for which protons are in fact causally responsible. To put it in a nutshell, the epistemological properties of theories are, of course, sensitive to their intentional and semantic properties. What we want of our beliefs is that their contents should be true. But maybe only the computational properties of our theories matter to their role in fixing the meanings of mental representations. For those purposes our theories are just the formalism we use to calculate what to put in the belief box when. Second, the condition I'm imagining is supposed to be sufficient but not necessary for our proton meaning proton. For all I care, there may be other sorts of roots that would connect concepts to their instances in a semantically relevant way, for example, ones that don't depend on the existence of psycho H WS. I emphasize this point because I don't trust Granny, give her an a priori connection between content and, what she calls, the possibility of experience, and she's likely to try for anti-metaphysical arguments in the familiar, positivist vein, worse still, for philosophical constraints on the conceptual apparatus of science. Chickasan Rocker, I am not doing critical philosophy. Rather, I'm arguing with a guy who says that there are a priori, metaphysical reasons for supposing that semantics can't be naturalized. A plausible, naturalistic, sufficient condition for A's meaning is all I need to win the argument with him. Third, although the present condition for proton meaning proton is a lot more plausible than the crude requirement that all protons cause protons, it is still too strong to be entirely plausible. For example, it requires the tokening of proton in all environments in which psychophysical consequences for which protons are causally responsible are detected. But, of course, there may be correlations between protons and psychophysical traces that nobody knows about, correlations that our current physics doesn't specify, and such correlations are ipso facto unlikely to function as links in chains from protons to protons. For instance, for all I know, I am right now registering psychophysical traces that are specific to protons. That my belief box is nevertheless innocent of a tokening of proton would not imply that I lack that cotildencept. All that would follow is that my internalized physics is incomplete. 0h boy, is it ever? But I don't propose to linger over this sort of worry. It seems to me that we are now playing in the right ballpark and the rest is arguably just fine-tuning. Perhaps what we want to say is sufficient for proton meaning proton is that there be at least one kind of environment in which there are psychophysical traces of protons which, when detected, cause the tokening of proton in the belief box. Or perhaps, slightly more interesting, the right thing to say is that there should be a fair number of such kinds of environments, thereby allowing the concept having the concept proton to exhibit the sort of vagueness of boundary characteristic of most of the notions that the special sciences employ, compare river, tornado, feudal society, female, and the like. Fourth, precisely because the present proposal requires only that there be the right kind of correlation between protons and protons, we're allowing the fixation of meaning by radically false theories. On this view, somebody who believes really crazy things, that protons are alive, as it might be, could still have the concept proton. He would do so if his crazy theory happens to have the property of reliably connecting protons with protons via their psychophysical traces. For reasons given in Chapter 3, I regard this as a virtue. People can have radically false theories and really crazy views, consonant with our understanding perfectly well, thank you, which false views they have and what radically crazy things it is that they believe. Berkeley thought that chairs are mental, for heaven's sake. Which are we to say he lacked, the concept mental or the concept chair? A consequence of the present view is that although theories mediate symbol/world connections, still meaning H.Olasm is not thereby implied. That's because the content of a theory does not determine the meanings of the terms whose connections to the world the theory mediates. What determines their meanings is which things in the world the theory connects them to. The unit of meaning is not the theory, it's the world /symbol correlation however mediated. Let me tell you, by way of making the spirit of the proposal clear, a story about what was wrong with verificationism. Verify, cationism was the idea that the meaning of an expression could be identified with whatever root connects the use of the expression to its denotation. So, for example, there's something that connects our use of the word star to stars, a causal chain that starts with light leaving stars, passing maybe through telescopes, falling on our retinas, and eventuating in utterances of star, mutatis mutandis, with tokenings of star in the belief box. The verificationist idea was that it is that sort of thing that constitutes the meaning of star. Now, there is something right about this, namely, that tokenings of the verification procedures for star must have stars on one end and stars on the other. It is true a priori that when they work, verification procedures connect terms with their denotations. If they didn't, they wouldn't be verification procedures. But there is something wrong with it too. Namely, that verification procedures connect terms with their denotations in too many ways. Think of the routes along which stars can get connected to tokenings of star, via just looking, via looking at reflections in a puddle, via inference from astronomical theory, via inference from astrological theory, via inference from what somebody happened to say, via paintings of stars in a museum, via just thinking about stars, etc. The point is that star isn't umpteen ways ambiguous. These different routes do not determine correspondingly different semantic values for star. On the contrary, what determines the semantic value of star is precisely what all these routes have in common, viz., the fact that they connect stars with stars. The moral is that the route doesn't matter much. What makes star mean star is that the two are connected, not how the two are connected. It's the covariance that counts. Similarly for concepts, of course. It may be that my concept of water is, from time to time, connected to water via my concept of cat. I believe that water is what cats like. I find that my cat likes this stuff. I infer that this stuff is water. But it has not being connected to water via cat that makes my concept of water a water concept. What makes it a water concept is that its tokenings covary with water instances under appropriate circumstances by whatever route the covariance may be achieved. That theories mediate the semantically relevant concept to world connections does not imply meaning holism. For we get meaning by quantifying over the roots from a symbol to its denotation. Summary: just a word to recapitulate the architecture of the discussion that we've been pursuing. We started with the crude idea that a plausible sufficient condition for A's to express A is that it is nomologically necessary that 1. Every instance of a cause is a token of A, and 2. Only instances of a cause tokens of A. The slightly less crude causal theory of content offers the following two friendly amendments. 4. 2. Read, if non-A's cause A's, then their doing so is asymmetrically dependent upon A's causing a S. 4. 1. Read, all instances of A's cause A's when I, the A's are causally responsible for psychophysical traces to which 2. The organism stands in a psychophysically optimal relation. What's claimed for SLCCTC is that it does what metaphysical skeptics about intentionality doubt can be done. It provides a sufficient condition for one part of the world to be semantically related to another part, specifically, for a certain mental representation to express a certain property. It does so in non-intentional, non-semantical, non-teleological, and, in general, non-question-begging vocabulary, and it is reasonably plausible. It isn't crazy to suppose that at least some mental symbols have the content that they do because they stand in the sort of relation to the world that SLCCTC prescribes. I do, however, admit to two checks still outstanding. I've helped myself to the notion of an intact organism, and I've helped myself to the notion of one event being the cause of another. I have therefore to claim that, whatever the right unpacking of these concepts may be, it doesn't smuggle in intentional /semantic notions, perhaps, in the lat meaning and the world order 127 ter case, via the alleged, granny and I don't believe it for a minute interest relativity of explanation. Obligation noted. On the other hand, there is nothing in this line of thought to comfort a skeptic, for if intact organism and the cause of an event are indeed covertly intentional /semantic, then it looks as though belief /desire psychology isn't, after all, the only science whose practice presupposes that intention of semantic categories are metaphysically kosher. That the organism is, relevantly, intact is part of the background idealization of practically all biological theorizing, and, so I believe, we need to distinguish between the cause of an event and its causally necessary conditions wherever we do the kind of science that is concerned with the explanation of particular happenings. Compare the formation of the Great Siberian Crater, the extinction of the dinosaur, and the like. So if intact organism and the cause are indeed intentional /semantic, then there is nothing special about belief /desire psychology after all. The availability of intentional apparatus would then be quite widely presupposed in the special sciences, so its deployment by psychologists for the explanation of behavior would require no special justification. In which case, I've just wasted a lot of time that I could have put in sailing. Ah well.